Please don't tell.
By Storm Butt. The tags for the story are romance and slice of life. Spike is developing feelings for a certain unicorn who has white fur, blue eyes, and is involved in the fashion industry. That's right, it's Fancy Pants. He's just so nice and kind and handsome. It's been complicated to say the least. Spike has never quite felt like this before, and the struggle to deal with these emotions is getting more difficult as time goes on. On a whim, he decides to have a heart-to-heart with Fancy Pants and try to get some answers. The ponies that star in the story are Rarity, Spike, and Fancy Pants.
I don't know what's wrong with my brain right now.
Unforeseen confession, and that's not how you spell unforeseen. With 6,157 words. Fancy Pants wasn't the first uptight and prissy-appearing stallion that Spike had found himself unwillingly determined to dislike upon meeting him. With every pony related to the fashion industry came a certain set of rules that Spike had made long ago that he didn't need to keep track of by quill and ink, because he would always be reminded upon meeting some pony new. They were usually well-dressed, hated the idea of dirt, and far too self-centered and airheaded to take seriously without extensive mocking. What was different about Fancy Pants, and therefore annoying in a different sort of way, was the fact that Spike was finding it difficult to really nail this pony to the third rule. Even now, sitting there with the morning sunlight reflecting off of his monocle and a cup of coffee in the grasp of his magic touch to his lips, he didn't seem that Spike had first assumed to be as prissy. It had been a long week where he had done what Twilight had ever so irritatingly nicknamed his blind-crushing help with Rarity. He had claimed time and time again that it was normal to help a good friend out for hours on end with no payment and effort that even a paid employee would complain at. He had gone through many pins jabbed into his scaly sides and arms carrying dozens of pounds of weight in fabric for years for Rarity, to the point where even he seemed to have fallen into routine. He didn't mind most days when he was called upon, though. Unless, of course, it was a day, or worst-case scenario, several weeks, where a pony from Canterlot was visiting to help Rarity with a certain project. The third rule hadn't applied once. Spike had seen Fancy Pants on the morning of his arrival exactly 1 week prior, and had not only expected to hate him on the spot, but intended on it. But something was different about Fancy Pants. Even now, he wasn't overly dressed, and ever so self-conscious, as many of the ponies had been referring to as whiny fabric spewers had been. He was wearing an expensive-looking morning robe in the color of maroon that was wrinkled and messy, slipping down one half of his shoulder. His mane was a bit messy and unkempt, tied back as Spike had studied him doing what he was in the middle of something that required his focus. He felt real, not plastic like some of the ponies who rolled through here. The ponies that mocked Rarity's tiny shop and touched the furniture like it was a cheap imitation of what Spike could only assume must be solid gold by their reactions. "Shoot," Fancy Pants mumbled, his breath pushed back, steam arising from his coffee until it dissipated in the air. "What?" Spike asked suddenly. "Forgetting to breathe. Am I dying?" His voice was quick and cracked a bit when he broke in a way that instantly made him blush. He hadn't realized it until now, but he was sitting strange. He was on the stage where Rarity normally put finishing touches on her dresses, his back straight, not hunched like usual. "Get out of here!" And his hands pressed together with his fingers intertwined. He hadn't meant to stare at Fancy Pants, but he found himself doing so regardless. "Oh, nothing." Fancy Pants sighed in a manner that was irritated, but more so directed at himself than anything. He waved a quill about him with a magic that, up until this moment, Spike had been looking past. It was fluffy and red, but the end was dried-looking. "This ink seems to have run dry. I say, does Rarity mind parting with another jar?" Spike got off the stage slowly. He He wasn't actually sure if Rarity would mind Fancy Pants using her personal ink for what seemed like it had been a personal letter by the way the stallion had kept smirking and chuckling throughout it. Spike nodded regardlessly. He's not writing a letter, he's just writing dick blood all over the thing. And went to the other room quickly to search through one of Rarity's cabinets before finding a small jar of writing ink. When he returned to the room, Fancy Pants was adjusting his monocle and tilting his head away from the sunlight. His eyes were... Now, this is in ellipses here, which means we gotta pause for a second. Blue. Now, there's another ellipsis, which means we have to pause for another second. A blue that was a bit captivating to look at. Spike found himself squeezing at the jar of ink when they met his eyes, and he forced himself to look away when he approached the stallion. Fancy Pants was not in the least bit threatening, and maybe that was why it was so concerning to Spike, why he felt like he should feel this way. Thank you, darling. I don't think Fancy Pants has ever said darling. I mean, his lines of dialogue have only been, like, 5 sentences, I think. I don't remember the episode, but it was like, I don't remember darling ever in that sentence. Fancy Pants chuckled and reached out a hoof. With the end of it brushed against Spike's fingers, he felt a bit of Fancy's fur, and more in particular, how soft it was. His leg was thick with muscle, and he held this strong but gentle force when he tugged on Spike's fingers when the dragon forgot to release it. Yeah, no prob, man. Spike nodded his head and retracted his hands to his chest. His stutter was something that he didn't expect to come from his lips. He touched his fingers before he squeezed them in his fist. So he took one hand, and he touched his fingers a bit, like this. Spike, you're fucking cray-cray. Fancy nodded his head, his thoughts already drifting away from the moment as he used his hooves to pry open the cork of the ink bottle. Spike felt a pang of something in his chest tighten when he noticed without realizing that his upper leg bulged a little with force of muscle when he did this. It made him feel... Now there's another ellipsis here. Strange. Strange was a word he had been feeling a lot lately, especially around Fancy Pants. The stallion was kind of in the sort of way that Spike had thought only Rarity possessed in ponies interested in fashion, but in a different way entirely. What? The stallion was kind in the sort of way that Spike had thought only Rarity possessed in the ponies interested in fashion, but in a different way entirely. That doesn't make any sense. I can't wrap my head around that sentence. He called Spike darling because he meant that as an insult. More often than his actual name, but it wasn't in the sort of materialistic, cutest way that Rarity's other clients in the high fashion industry had talked to him before. They had always felt moments away from pinching his cheeks if that old and tired cliché would ever die. Fancy talked normally to him. Aside from his accent, he didn't sound fake to Spike. When will Miss Rarity be back with the fabrics, if I may ask? Fancy Pants questioned, his eyes briefly flickering towards Spike, and once again Spike could swear they glimmered. He found his chest tightening once more, and without realizing it, he grabbed at the end of his tail and squeezed it. About 30 minutes. Spike answered with another stutter that this time made him flinch. He felt annoyed at himself for 2 reasons, one being his stupid tongue, the other being the fact that he was unsure why he felt so nervous. He felt as though he felt the thought run through his head again and again that Fancy was just another Canterlot big shot pony, yet still he felt nervous when those eyes met his. Sorry, she said she'd be right back before you came in. I could have made you that coffee, you know. Oh, please, it felt nice to do something routine for once. Fancy Pants took a sip from Rarity's pink mug and then wiped at his lips with a napkin. Besides, it gave me time to think over this letter. It's been quite a trial trying to word it, if I must say. Just right, dick butts. Again with that non-directed irritation that Spike actually found refreshing for a change. Most Canterlot ponies were far too uptight about their annoyance and were quick to lash it out on any pony who happened to be close by. Usually that was Spike, since they would never snap at Rarity. Who are you writing to? Spike found himself asking. He tugged at one of his fingers when he realized he was staring at the V-shape that was down Fancy Pants' robe, and in truth, the way a few tufts of fur on his chest stuck out and looked softer than any coat Spike had ever seen. It was almost a reminder of how he had looked at
Rarity.
Spike made an involuntary sound when that thought crossed his head. He tried to cover it up with a cough when Fancy looked at him. Just my boyfriend. Oh, girl, Fancy mumbled in a way that was half focused on the conversation, half focused on what he was writing. The quill scribbled for a few seconds, and a small frown crossed his lips. I'm explaining to him that I might be a day or two late. He's going to let me have an earful about it if it turns out to be the case. Boyfriend? Spike asked. It wasn't intended to sound so dumbfounded. Yes. And another ellipsis. Fancy's eyes drew from the page slowly, and then onto Spike's like heavy weights that pierced his scales. He drew out the word as if it were suddenly walking on thin ice, and was watching his words carefully. Fancy had this way of removing most emotion from his eyes, yet somehow still seeming as though he were reading a pony. He had done it multiple times to Rarity whenever she questioned his decisions on the dresses, the closest he had come to applying to Spike's never-broken third rule. Please don't tell me Ponyville happens to be one of those dreadful towns. No. Spike shook his head quickly. And another ellipsis. I was just wondering, you know? He tried to laugh it off, but Fancy Pants raised his eyebrow in suspicion. Would you like to sit down? Fancy Pants asked, and nodded his head to the opposite side of the small table. It was no less than 4 feet across, and Spike found himself nodding after but a moment of hesitation, and sliding into the chair. Fancy Pants sipped at the coffee again, and kept his eyes locked on Spike. Spike stared down at the letter, but was unable to make out the writing both through it being upside down, and the fact that it was written in such a stylized, loopy kind of way, he might have had trouble reading it right side up. That's called cursive, you uncultured swine. Are you positive that doesn't bother you? Fancy asked. There was a sort of tired sigh at the end of his tone, as if he had repeated this over 100 times. I assure you that I've found you very cute up until this point, and I'd hate for my opinion to change so suddenly. Who the fuck are you? You just met this guy, right? So, it's like, I found you very cute, but if you hate faggots like me, it's like, why do you care? Why do you care about this dragon? This little fucking guy that works for the fashion horse. Why do you care? Cute! Spike decided to focus on that part in particular. Suddenly, that feeling he had been suppressing re-emerged stronger than before. Something that felt like guilt. As if he were doing something wrong. He could remember a similar feeling, but not as conflicting when he was young, and accidentally burnt a hole in the floor and tried to cover it with a rug. Back then, he knew why he felt so stricken, but the way Fancy had called him cute had made him... Another ellipsis. Happy? Don't let it go to your head, darling. Fancy Pants chuckled enough for his expression to soften. When he smiled, his teeth were straight and white. Spike felt the feeling come in waves when it was directed towards him. The pretty ones do, and they'll become awfully bland once they're aware. But yes, if you must know, I am writing to my boyfriend. Oh, Spike felt weird for being able to say nothing else. I didn't mean to make you think that. What's he like? Fancy Pants chuckled again. And again, Spike felt weird. Like clockwork. Like pottery. He's a spoiled prince, and he lives in a castle, and is nearly half my age, and beautiful beyond belief. The worst part is, when I tell ponies that story, no pony seems to quite believe. As if I didn't have enough to toot my own. Fancy smiled again, almost as if he simply couldn't hold back his glee. It's almost like they don't believe some middle-aged, overweight unicorn could score some pony like that without resorting to cash. The nerve. He was sarcastic, too. Another reason that Spike found it hard to label him as self-centered. He at least seemed to have a bit of sense of humor that made him all the more authentic and likable. Oh. When Spike said it again, he wanted to bite his tongue. He was struggling to think of something to say, but his mind was drawing a blank, to the point where he actually felt his cheeks grow a little hot at the gaze of Fancy Pants on him felt so intense. Despite the fact that Rarity has been a wonderful host and co-worker, and you have been a fine enough helper, I do worry that this design isn't having much of a breakthrough fast enough. Fancy Pants sighed and let the quill sit in the ink for a few moments too long. He's going to give me an earful about booking my schedule so tight and not giving enough breathing room with his endeavor. Honestly, when he gets hot-headed, it's like talking to my father again. Fancy Pants blinked. His expression lightened, and he looked to Spike with a bit of a shy smile. Apologies, I'm complaining aloud. He chuckled, with a small tint of pink on his cheeks. If I was a bit less sane, I'd ask to go to Princess Twilight's place and hide from him when he reads this letter. He has a tendency to chew my ear off. Spike said a bit less enthusiastically than he meant. He could see it in Fancy's eyes that he hadn't sounded suitably enthused enough to be making that well of an impression. Something intermingled with the feeling of strange guilt that he felt almost like fear that he was perhaps coming off poorly. I don't really know a lot about that fancy-schmancy Canterlot stuff. Rarity talks about it sometimes, but I don't listen too much, Spike admitted, and scratched at his cheek with his claw when he shrugged. I know this is apparently some kind of big deal, you coming down and all. Rarity's been babbling for days about you came up about how working with you while skyrocket her right next to designing the princess's dress or something. That was a run-on sentence. Well, don't let me break her heart, but I doubt she'll go that far that quickly. Fancy Pants rolled his eyes and smiled. But yes, big deal might be a good word for both of us. She's a bit of an up-and-comer in this line of work. Not many ponies as high as I do like to take the risk of working with the low ones in case they hit something lucky and produce dud after dud. Photo finish almost ruined her career once when photographing a particularly horrid of orange in a spring setting because it was the creator's dream or something insane. What's wrong with orange in spring? Spike raised his eyebrow, and Fancy Pants rolled his eyes, once again coming close to his third rule. The third one, the third one that we don't fucking know! Honestly, I forget that not every pony is as obsessed with color schemes as I am. Fancy Pants laughed. Spike felt his cheeks grow warm and his chest clench once more at that thought. It sounded so warm and comforting. Oh wait, that was an ellipsis. We gotta do it like this. Comforting. He didn't feel like he was being teased at all. I'm sorry, I'm dreadfully boring you. I'd bet you'd rather talk about one of your comics or something along those lines, correct? What? Spike tried to laugh and once again straightened out his back. No wait, that stuff is way more immature than me. Didn't I see you reading one the first few days you helped out? Fancy Pants asked. There was a bit of confusion in his tone. No way! Spike tried to make a psh. There's a balloon. But it sounded more like he was forcing a sort of whinny. He really didn't want to go into the cold, hard fact that he had stopped bringing the comic for the same reason why he hid it when Rarity came into the room. He didn't want Fancy to think less of him, as strange as it seemed. He wanted to seem more level-headed and not interested in bright, flashy outfits and poorly cliched and cheesy lines of dialogue. Why he wanted this, he didn't know. All right, then. Fancy Pants sounded unconvinced, but he chuckled again regardless. Spike looked down to the letter again. He touched his knees under the table and squeezed at his flesh. That's a little lewd. There was a lump in his throat that was particularly difficult to swallow when he caught himself once more staring at Fancy Pants' chest, and more importantly, his thick neck that seemed strong like the rest of him. He wasn't slender and graceful like Rarity, more large and forceful in a way that he had adapted to carry himself just as well, if not better. You're into borrows, bro. He felt that guilt hit him again. It hit him the hardest when he thought about the fact that he had been looking more at Fancy Pants than Rarity these past few days while they worked. He had never just flat out ignored Rarity for as long as he had recently, and that in turn made him frown and touch his chest near the beating of his heart. Hey, Fancy Pants? Spike asked, and looked up to the unicorn who was currently scribbling near the end of the page of his letter. Did you think I was going to be weird about you having a boyfriend? Fancy shrugged his shoulders. Maybe a little. You get used to that kind of assumption when it's as well known as me. Some ponies have an awfully loud mouth. Oh. Spike found his words trailing off. For some reason, those words unsettled in him. Do they make fun of you a lot? Like teasing and stuff when you first started dating him? Oh, they do worse than that sometimes. Fancy Pants sighed loudly and sipped at his last of his coffee. I've learned to have thick skin, though I suppose some pony who hasn't dealt with criticism about something like I have with dresses might not. I know my boyfriend certainly isn't at times. Spike made the grunting sound as he nodded his head. He linked his hands together under the table and interlocked his fingers before squeezing them. But I mean, you've never felt into a girl? What? I don't care. Like wanting to kiss one or anything, right? I never said that. Fancy Pants looked up from his letter. I've dated mares, yes, and stallions too. Is there a point to all of this? Sorry. Spike stuttered the apology and stared down below the table. He heard Fancy sigh and squeezed his eyes shut. He felt like he had said something not only wrong, but suddenly the idea of Rarity hearing about it and her getting the wrong idea. Whatever idea he was afraid of her getting in the first place, that is. Because there was an ellipsis there. Wait a minute. He heard Fancy sigh and squeezed his eyes shut. Did Spike squeeze his eyes shut? Or did he hear Fancy squeeze his eyes shut? Is that what you're saying? Those are some loud-ass eyeballs. No, I am. Fancy sighed in a tired sort of way. Forgive me. I've grown up into a bitter old man about the whole thing. I'm so used to interviewers forgetting I actually make dresses whenever I date a stallion. Do the reporters... In an ellipsis? Spike hesitated briefly, bit at his inner cheek, and waited until Fancy Pants nodded before continuing. He smiled again, and Spike felt guilty for taking pleasure in the warmth it gave off. I mean, they make it into a big deal, right? Rarity gets a lot of gossip magazines from Canterlot. I tried reading one once, but it was way too girly for me to get into. A big deal is an understatement. Fancy Pants grumbled. I swear, it's like my own personality is sucked up and erased sometimes. Fancy Pants suddenly bit at his lower lip, and his expression darkened for just a moment before softening. Apologies, I'm running my mouth again. It's almost as bitter as this coffee today. No, it's fine. Spike nodded his head and tried to smile. It hurt a little bit, mostly because it was forced. I like hearing you talk. Really, I do. Fucking faglord. Spike thought to himself, well, that doesn't sound clingy and desperate at all. At least he knows. God, what am I reading? What is the point? What is the point of anything? It was like plunging a knife into his own chest when he had to resist the urge to call himself stupid. Well, you and my boyfriend seems to be the only ones. I suppose you'll tell me I'm handsome too, like he does. Fancy Pants laughed. Which reminds me, do look at my face or something when I write out the sex part. I believe I'm on good terms with Rarity, and what I'm about to write to him might put me on bad terms if you get a peek and repeat any of it. Spike thought he was joking, but then his expression turned serious. He nodded to assure he wouldn't look at the letter, and he smiled again. The smile Spike liked. The thought hadn't actually crossed his mind until Fancy had blatantly said it, but something that he had been stirring in his thoughts came to the surface once Fancy had given it a term. Fancy really was handsome. Even fresh out of bed and with ruffled hair and frumpy fur, he still made Spike's chest feel weird to look at. He remembered a term that Twilight had once said was overused and didn't make quite much sense in romance novels. Heartthrob. He felt his face flush when the term popped into his head. He really didn't want to apply Fancy Pants to that word with just how confused his thought process had been for the past several days, yet it was already done. And now he couldn't stop thinking of the resemblance Fancy Pants had to a character on a novel cover Rarity once desperately took from him when he found it on her bed looked. That's not a sentence. That's not a proper sentence. And now he couldn't stop thinking of the resemblance Fancy Pants had to a character on a novel cover Rarity once desperately took from him when he found it on her bed looked. Why is the word looked at the end of that sentence with the period? Whatever, He was sitting in a robe much similar to Fancy's, but much more blatantly open to expose his chest. That had made him feel weird too, but at the time he had written it off as second-hand embarrassment because of just how flustered Rarity had become. He tried to stop thinking about it, couldn't, and then felt like he was once more doing something wrong. Something wrong? Fancy questioned. I think you're handsome. Spike. I gotta redo that. I think you're handsome. Spike blurted out. It was the only thing to come to his mind. He sat stunned at what he had just said, and then made a long drawn-out noise that slipped out between his closed lips. So good. What the fuck is wrong with me? Oh, God. Why, thank you, Fancy Pants laughed. Well, now I can rub it in his face that another dragon thinks so as well. Sure, Spike said, a bit too loud and a bit too fast to sound natural. Fancy pushed his mane back and revealed more of his well-structured face. The blocky nature of his structure was different from how the mares he normally surrounded himself with. It was a lot stronger looking. Spike realized he was staring into Fancy's eyes again. They really were distracting. Wait, you were staring at his blocky face. Like he's fucking Minecraft or some shit. Spike looked away and out the window. The morning sun was rising fast to a quickly nearing noon. He swallowed a lump in his throat and felt his fingers drum roll against the surface of the table. Like this? Huh. He was beginning to not only feel uncomfortable in the silence, but the fact that Fancy's eyes were pouring into him like ice. You're different. Different? Fancy Pants raised his eyebrow. You just... And another Ulysses. Are... Spike bit the inside of his cheek so his words sounded a bit muffled. You're a lot nicer than the ponies Rarity works with. They push me around a lot and they get real nasty when stuff doesn't go their way. But you helped her a lot, and me too. Plus, you don't just want to decorate me like I'm some old doll or something, like most of them do. That's how that sentence read out. Well, I never said that. Fancy smirked, as if it were obvious this were a joke. Though I'm sorry if Canterlot's top percent has made you feel this way. I admit we're a bit privileged, to put it lightly. Spike smiled back, and then frowned. His emotions were conflicting, to say the least. Are they gonna fucking make out? Just get to the kissing already. I mean... Spike chuckled and felt his face grow warm. He was becoming nervous, and it was both physically obvious and verbally by the way he was suddenly struggling not to stutter. It's just weird, is all. You're really handsome, but you're not a jerk. I don't feel weird talking to you like all the prissy stallions and mares. You even hold the door open for me when I'm carrying a lot of stuff. Not even Rarity does that sometimes. Spike scratched at his cheek with the end of his claw. His chest was tight, and his heart was beginning to pound. And you're handsome, Spike added. You already said that, darling. Fancy Pants uttered in a sudden tonal shift. Something about him went from light-hearted to what he could only assume was close to concerned. Suddenly, the conversation shifted to a place that Spike really, really did not want it to shift. 3 times, actually. Is something the matter? Spike shook his head. Something is really wrong here, actually, Spike. You should probably take his advice. I just wanted to let you know. I don't know, making conversation, I guess. Spike grabbed his arm by the shoulder and squeezed it until his claws dug into his scales. We can talk about something else if it's weird. This is probably prying past what I deserve to do. Fancy Pants mumbled in a way that almost sounded like he was talking to himself. But I must ask, there isn't a reason you were asking so much about me and my boyfriend, was there? Past just light conversation, I mean. I don't... No. Spike found himself pausing more often than not, and his heart was beginning to beat faster. He felt himself sweat as though he were under a burning spotlight, and wished more than anything that he could reverse time. Nothing at all. Fancy pried more. Spike was beginning to think he was less of a heartthrob by the second, though the fact that the word crossed his mind at all made him dig his claws deeper into his shoulder. Spike couldn't find his voice. He opened his mouth a few times, but nothing came out. Oh dear, Fancy Pants said in a tone that Spike absolutely despised. It was the kind of tone that sounded like he was getting involved in something that he didn't quite want to pry into. I didn't say anything to give you the wrong idea about liking stallions, did I? What? What? Spike snapped, a little louder and more confident than before, but it broke when he spoke again, and his voice cracked. What are you talking about? I just mean, if I'm not too far off the mark here, and believe me, I've made bigger mistakes in the past. Fancy Pans. Fancy Pants. Fucking, there's a fucking frying pan with a monocle and a fancy stash on it. Okay. Fancy Pans bit at his lower lip and then touched his temple to rub it slowly in circles. Oh dear, Fancy repeated. I don't want to talk about this. Spike crossed his arms and stared directly away from Fancy Pants. All right, I'm just saying. Fancy Pants leaned forward a bit, so Spike had to look away even further to get the stallion entirely out of his sight. He pretended he was so interested in one of the dressed put on display, and tried very hard to believe it. Anything to pretend like he didn't get wrapped into this awkward conversation. You should really be having this conversation with Princess Twilight or so. No! Spike suddenly yelled. Somehow he blindly hit his fist down against the table and felt his eyes widen fearfully. Somehow he blindly hit his fist. Wait, somehow? Never mind. I don't care. Don't tell her! He yelled with more force than he probably should have. The mere thought of this happening sparked unknown fear that he didn't even know he held. Don't tell her, a Rarity, please! They don't need to know. It doesn't have to. They don't. Nothing's wrong. You have the wrong idea. Okay. Fancy Pants held out both of his hooves until Spike managed to calm both his panic and breathing down to a gentle dig of his claws into his knees. We don't have to talk about it. I don't want them to think of me differently. Spike mumbled and closed his eyes. It's just weird because you're so nice. That could be it, right? Maybe. Fancy Pants blindly agreed with Spike's half-finished thought and nodded his head. There was concern in his eyes that bothered Spike beyond belief.
There was a long silence.
Where Spike bit his tongue and found himself repeating the word stupid again and again in his mind. Could you get me more coffee while I change? Fancy Pants asked. He held out his mug. I'll be just a minute. Spike wasn't sure if this was to distract him or change the subject, but either way, he took the mug without thinking and nodded his head. He got down from the chair quickly and to the place in the kitchen where he didn't have to look at Fancy Pants stand up and walk to the next room. Why do you have a love interest with long-running sentences, dude? Why? When he poured the coffee, he felt his heart beat, and fast. He stood at the counter with a mug in both of his hands for a long time, staring at his own reflection in the mug, trying to think of a way to worm out of the situation. Maybe if he hadn't reacted so violently, he could try to play it off as some kind of joke. A few minutes passed, and then he heard hoofsteps again. He turned his head to look over his shoulder and saw Fancy Pants in a dress shirt and a blue bow tie around his neck that he was in the process of tying up with his magic when their eyes met. Maybe Spike would have managed to calm down if his first thought wasn't just how handsome the unicorn appeared to be. Oh my God, you're gay! Spike approached Fancy Pants gingerly, and when Fancy took the mug of coffee with his magical grasp, he was left to stare down at his feet and cross his arms. His mouth twisted uncomfortably while the two stood in silence. Fancy sipped at his coffee and then took a long-winded sigh. Please don't tell Rarity, he asked again. He closed his eyes, wishing more than anything he could trust Fancy Pants to do just this. She'll tell Twilight, and then what? Fancy Pants asked. He seemed genuinely curious. He extended his hoof and placed it on Spike's shoulder. Spike hated how gentle it felt, how it made him feel the slightest bit comforted when he wanted to feel disgusted. They'll just tease me for a while, Spike grumbled and shrugged. They'll freak out too. I don't know. and they'll think I'm girly and weird and start treating me different. That's not what being attracted to stallions means, darling. Fancy Pants tried to assure her, and then frowned at Spike when the dragon shrugged again. You don't change what you like. You're still yourself. I don't want to talk about it. Spike mumbled and hugged himself tightly. He heard a sigh that almost made him cringe. Fancy Pants sipped at his coffee again, and when Spike dared to look up, his smile was there, and warm. His eyes seemed silently reassuring, in a way that Spike wanted to dislike. Oh, the cheese in this. Oh, I could taste it. I could taste the cheese. It's yummy. Oh, wait, that isn't cheese. It's smegma! All right, Fancy said, a hint of regret in his tone. But just so you know, I believe you would have been a hit with the stallions as well as mares when you get older, as cute as you are. As cute you are. That's not how you say that sentence. Fancy Pants leaned his head down and very lightly and briefly pressed his lips into Spike's cheek. Spike jumped a bit, felt his eyes widen, and in the 2 seconds between Fancy pulling his face away and Spike slapping the spot, he felt it grow Wait, what? Spike jumped a bit, felt his eyes widen, and in the 2 seconds between Fancy pulling his face away and Spike slapping the spot, he felt it grow very flushed and warm. The spot where... Oh yeah, cheek, yeah. His heart started beating fast, and words blurred all together in his head. His cock just became erect, like instantly. He felt guilty, and happy, and confused all at once, and then the feelings were interrupted. The back door to Carousel Boutique flew open just as a purple-maned unicorn wearing big, dazzling pink sunglasses entered with 3 bags floating around her with the glow of her horn. Spike jumped, and Fancy Pants pat his shoulder as he went by. "Why, good morning, Miss Rarity," Fancy Pants said to the mare. "Oh, Fancy Pants," Rarity cooed and kissed the stallion's cheek politely. Not how Fancy had just kissed him, but more adult and, well, acceptable. "You would not believe the trouble I had to go through to find this specific pattern. It felt like 100 years trying to see it. Now which one do you think would work?" Spike crossed his arms and wandered away, slowly at that. He stayed in the room and looked to the two, just stayed in the corner. They talked for a bit, and laughed as if what had just happened didn't make Spike feel like his chest was about to explode. He stared at Fancy Pants, and felt the word handsome cross his mind once more. He was able to control whatever he was feeling so easily. Spike envied him. There we are. "Oh, Spiky," Rarity called out and locked her eyes onto Spike. "Can you do me a favor and fetch me some... Rarity?" Fancy Pants raised his hoof just as Spike was standing up straight. "Apologies, but right before you walked in, I asked Spike to deliver my letter so we could get to work as soon as you got back. Do you mind terribly?" Spike bit the inside of his cheek when he saw Fancy Pants raise the letter from the table to before him, and in the blink of an eye, a poof occurred, and it was nearly wrapped into an envelope that shined bright red. Nearly wrapped? I bet you mean neatly, don't you? "Of course not." Rarity giggled and waved for Spike to come close. When he did so, he wondered if he looked off, and if Rarity could tell. She seemed a bit too invested in the fabric she had bought, looking at each of them one by one and mumbling something under her breath such as, No, that won't do. What was I thinking?" Spike took the letter, but Fancy held the other half just a moment until their eyes met. He was smiling, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Try to hurry. My boyfriend ought to know what I have to tell him quickly. My boyfriend ought to know what I have to tell him quickly, understand?" Something behind those words made Spike feel uncomfortable. He knew what Fancy was saying, but it made his chest seize and his stomach twist just to think about it. He nodded dumbly and looked away from those eyes before he was overridden with guilt. He wanted out, and fast. Just when he was nearing the door, he heard Rarity swoon over her choices, and Fancy Pants half-heartedly agree with her. He looked behind him once, and their eyes met. Fancy blinked once, and then looked away. Spike could not read his emotions, because he's not a changeling. Spike. When Spike closed the door behind him, he stopped. His toes dug into the grass directly outside of Rarity's door when he gripped the letter with both hands. His breathing was getting faster without his control, and his body wasn't agreeing with him when he begged it to calm down. He wanted to move, but felt stuck. He took a deep breath, but it was cut short by the sudden fear that flickered inside of him. Please don't tell. He whispered the bag to no pony in particular and closed his eyes, hugging the letter to his chest. He felt his eyes sting under his lids as the panic began to set in. Please don't tell, please don't tell. That's the end of the fucking story? Dude! The fuck? Did you write more? Come on. 25 stories. Okay, cool. What? That's the most recent story. What? Okay. No. No! He didn't. Where's this going? I want to know where it leads. Look at that. You made a fucking interesting story despite all of the fucking typos and the misusage of ellipses and run-on sentences. You made something that I want to see the end to, and you didn't write an end. So, please, write an end.